So, Ramon Amaro, I heard, well, he organised the conference here that really influenced me. Was it last year? Times Compressed, yeah. Which was called Techno-Resistance Black Futures, and I'm so happy to have him here today to talk about his work since then. He's a lecturer in the Department of Visual Cultures at Goldsmiths. He's a visiting tutor in media theory at the Royal Academy of Arts, The Hague, and former research fellow in digital culture at Het Nieuwe Instituut in Rotterdam. His research interests include machine learning, engineering, black ontology, and philosophies of being. Ramon has completed his PhD in philosophy at Goldsmiths while holding a master's degree in sociological research from the University of Essex and a BSc in mechanical engineering from the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. He's worked as assistant editor for the Sage open access journal Big Data and Society, quality design engineer for General Motors, and that's floored me, and programs manager for the American Society of Mechanical Engineers. So, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. So as you can see, I've had many lives. So, yes, thank you. Thank you for having me here today. It's been a really sort of exciting group of papers, and what's exciting for me is to think about these sort of common syntaxes, if you will, that are sort of materializing through these different types of work. So I'm going to talk for a brief moment, and then I'm going to actually show a piece of work, if you can even call it that, that I've been working on in collaboration for a bit of time now. But I'll just sort of go into this, and then we can get into questions and maybe elaborate on it later. But in human being as noun, or being human as praxis, toward the autopoetic turn, overturn, a manifesto. I love Sylvia Wynter's titles, right? Sylvia Wynter introduces the concept of autopoetically instituted living. For Wynter, autopoetic instituted living is a dynamic site of empirical ordering, and is set forth by the conditions of colonialism and the extension of the humanist project into the construction of the ideal form of man. In other words, as Kara Keeling argues, the black body is positioned within a spatio-temporal relation set forth by the enactment of empirical forms of knowledge production. As consequence, returning to Wynter, these spatial-temporal coordinates are not only predicated on the humanist imaginary, but also constitute a, quote, lifelike correlation between our modes of knowledge production and the auto-institution of our social realities. The auto-institution of social reality is an important notion in Wynter's thesis and in much of her bodies of work, as it illuminates the colonial relation as the product of an extensive network of data that are extracted from the site of the colonial coordinate. A coordinate comprises what she calls the bioepisteme. The bioepisteme, according to Wynter, enacts the replication of the social orders of reality through data, and again, this production of knowledge. But she's drawing on, when she's talking about the autopoetic order, she's drawing, of course, on Maturana, Varela, and Uribe's concept of autopoiesis to explain the phenomenon of living organisms and their cognitive capacities. An autopoetic system, therefore, is an enclosure, an autonomous system that distinguishes living from non-living systems. It describes living organisms as, quote, self-producing, and the nature of perception and intelligence as subject-dependent. Autopoiesis in this way is also a generative process of recursive recreation, particularly of the self. According to Maturana Varela, an autopoetic system is realized in the particular structure and is independent of its environment. So with Wynter picking up on the concept of autopoiesis, and I'll talk about the development of that outside of that framework perhaps later, but picking up on the concept of not just autopoiesis as an autoforming system, but the substance of race itself forming the spatial temporal relationship that is the system itself. And in doing so, presents itself as a materiality of reality itself, but is always a fictive element in which society is organized. But one of the additional key points about the concept of autopoiesis is the relationship Maturana establishes between closed recurrent systems and cognition. In general, cognition refers to the assimilation and use of knowledge, and as such is limited to beings with complex nervous systems. So it'd be interesting to talk about the debate with the supposedly non-sentient bodies. We can talk about that later. But although research on cognition has advanced significantly, Maturana believes that both cognition and perception are linked in the operation of the nervous system itself, which is realized through autopoiesis in the organism. Since the survival of autopoietic systems depends on the continuation of recurrent interactions, consequently, the organism has knowledge in itself, if only implicitly, that extends to cover all of the effective interactions that the organism is engaged in. So, in other words, as Maturana et al. Describes, the organization of cognitive systems defines a domain of interaction in which it can act and reenact itself. But in applying this autopoietic scheme to the colonial imaginary, Winter grasps the sort of layered patterning of global knowledge systems, such as colonial and imperial expansion, which function as perceptual categorization systems to produce cultural and political ideologies. Winter surmises that the enactment of the code of what constitutes colonized life, or the descriptive statement of the individual's body, functions at the level of the psyche or the soul, entangled with society's systems of learning and knowledge production. So it is believed that these codes must necessarily correlate or even determine the study of nature in this term and the terms of autopoiesis and social practice. But Winter also associates the construction of autopoietic social practice with the instrumentalization of science itself. And to do so, she turns to the episteme, which is a term we all know that Foucault is thinking through in the archaeology of knowledge to describe the type of coexistence of a set of relations that form the conditions of possibility itself, or as he derives in knowledge, and how this knowledge is situated within a particular historical period. But Foucault initially restricts the episteme to the distribution of scientific knowledge as a mode of power, but he expands the concept in later writings to account for other knowledges produced outside of science that remain invisible, concealed, and epistemologically unconscious. But as Foucault has shown, the episteme operates under discrete forms of mundane practices and solutions. And furthermore, the episteme is the means by which the other is not only brought into being, but made visible as difference in itself. Here, the other embodies the normalizing forces of power. In this sense, instrumental reason, which is executed under the democratization of calculus. And this is where Winter enters in again. But by this, Foucault means that the integration of dynamic modes of ordering and organization in society, these forces are reinforced through the enforcement of the right to disseminate rhetorical truths. But an immediate parallel is drawn between Foucault's outline of power and subject composition and Fanon's assessment of colonialism and the constitution of the colonial subject. And this is a proposal that Fanon puts forward in his lectures in Tunis, which we're still debating at this point, was arguably before Foucault. So Simone Brown actually will refuse to even use Foucault because they were actually contemporaries, and it was their speculation. Actually, it's within reason that Foucault would have been in Tunis to hear the lectures before the development of biopolitics, but that's a separate debate that I'll probably go down that. I'll go down that road later. But while both Fanon and Foucault are concerned with the distribution of power, their schematics depart in their unique treatment of initial conditions from which the measure of the other is constituted. On the one hand, Foucault presupposes a more general distribution of the means of power that brings the other into view. And although Fanon does not mention Foucault explicitly, he is critical of discourses that prioritize the means of subjection as universally embodied. So we sort of see the split between Fanon and Foucault. But Fanon places particular emphasis on the construction of race as the negation of being itself, where the subject is brought into being only in as much as it can be disregarded as a non-subject or a subject of non-being. And I'm going to move forward here just in the interest of time, but when I'm thinking through the actual distribution of power in terms of interpolation and how Fanon is organizing the spatial organization of the world through the lens of what Winter would call the substance of race, we can think about the articulation and the framing of life and death, and going back to sort of Aisha's thinking about these terms of life and death, the terms of capital, the terms of being, and the organization of those terms. And in this way, the colonized body, in this sense, lives as a universal form of history, yet is exposed as the negation of life itself in its physiological expression of the present. The result here is what Simone Brown calls digital epidermalization, which she draws from Fanon as well, or methods by which power is exercised through the disembodiment of the other under the gaze of surveillance and other types of technologies. And I'll talk about the future trajectory of my research perhaps in the Q&A, but looking at the actual effects of the engineering of the Black body, the construction of the form, not just metaphysically, but through the construction of actual infrastructure, through the construction of engineering technique, and even the symbolic mathematics that go into the subsumption of the life of the Black body. But as Brown demonstrates, like this type of fragility of the technological gaze is enacted under the alienating logics of truth and categorical reason. Nonetheless, in doing so, Brown builds upon the dissonant relationship between that Blacks have had with historical Anglo-centric technologies. But as she argues, understanding this relation is fundamental to any discourse, which in her terms is under surveillance, and what I argue is any discourse within any generative form of technologies, whether that be machine learning, AI, and so forth, is already predicated on the discourse of the spatial-temporal relationship of Black life. And this, for me, this is particularly important considering the prevalence of discourse today that centers the technical object as the subject of investigation itself, without thorough, if any, insight into how these technologies and social spaces are shaped by colonial and empirical expansion. So by connecting data to power and knowledge, I'm arguing that researchers can be implored to consider how data might replicate the immediacies of colonial discriminations and more so calculable determinancies. As Brown has shown, these logics of classification are enduring in their ability to stall the building of self-knowledge in the present while also regulating the existence of certain bodies even after death. And they also speak to sort of the immediate shaping of public space, which I talked about. To sort of diverge here, I know we don't have much time. I'm sort of just going to think through, because I would really like to show you some of what I've been working on. So building through this concept, I mean, there has been a substantial body of work that since Fanon, and this resurgence of popularity with Sylvia Wynter has brought back into the question of negation. But this is actually entering into a new space of divergence. It is a willingness to sort of read through Fanon outside of the forms of pathological negation themselves. And the risk in doing so, I guess it's not necessarily a risk, it's a discursive risk in the academy, but I should say the potential of doing so in that particular area is furthering the development of the breach that Fanon makes with the Hegelian dialectic of master and slave, which automatically assumes a sort of singularity of the body. And we see Moten just released 2 books this week too, right? Are you ref ready? So Moten released 2 books this week actually talking about divorcing the body itself into a plurality of the body and what it means for the black body to actually be in a plural space as well. And what I'm arguing is actually a rereading of Fanon is implicitly a rereading of Hegel, Merleau-Ponty, Lacan, Sartre, so on and so forth, which would always already put the black body into a plurality. So given this notion of plurality, what I'm setting as stable is, in a way, it's almost a scientific inquiry of a hypothesis of where the actual black body is situated, because that was Fanon's general search. Where is the colonized body? Where is the racialized body within this matrix of social spatial temporal ordering? And as he and Winter are situating this black body as non-being, what I'm seeking to do is actually take that as my hypothetical constant. If the black body is already non-being, then what is black being in the contemporary? And then how does that non-being itself get subsumed into technological apparatuses? So it's a bit of a divergence from representation as a mode of black discrimination, but more so an articulation of the black body as a kinetic process of continued production that again gets subsumed within the formation of the black body itself. Does that make any sense? Yeah. All right, makes sense in my head. So we'll see. But what it brings me to is thinking about keeping the black body as non-being, that assumption, and also keeping the Fanonian assumption as the black body as object, I'm arguing leaves a certain technological potential, particularly when we infuse that technological potential with a different type of ontogenesis and perhaps a Simonian type of ontogenesis. And if we can see that the black body is already in relationship to technology, then perhaps we can consider the black body itself as a technology and as a technological object. So then black being becomes not necessarily a reflection to whiteness, but black being actually becomes a pre-individuated state that forms itself at every capacity and articulation within any spatial temporal grid. But in doing so, the consequence of doing so would mean that the black technical object itself is already a kinetic generative being, which brings us back again to the motion and the organization of that space. But according to Masumi, whenever motion is perceived, we are presented with a type of double existence, an objective registering of sensory input, which we've talked about a lot today, and a perceptual feeling of continual type of motion. And I really appreciate that engagement with these really kinetic forms of negotiation between life of what is and the essence of life of what could be. But I sort of draw an immediate parallel between this concept Masumi's talking about a double existence to that of the notion of the double consciousness. And if we are to consider this consciousness along with motion, perhaps we have what Albert Michotte describes as the uncanny ability to survive the removal of the object itself. And if we do so, then blackness becomes not the object, but the momentum in which nothing visible can actually coincide. So here, what I'm really thinking through in terms of theory is thinking about new perceptual relationships to see. And not only new perceptual relationships of vision, but also how that vision is articulated as the communicative message of blackness itself, which becomes that train of double consciousness that Du Bois actually speaks of. Of course, he's coming from Hegel as well, and how that mode of transition is already kinetic. So I'm going to take you out of the theory bubble for a little bit, and thinking through a project that I've been working on in collaboration, so sort of appreciate the conversations earlier about collaborative type of work. Thinking through this idea was sort of born through my body of research, but also in my fellowship in Rotterdam, which was an interesting experience of not having a final project. The fellowship was just based on pure development. But my personal experience of being in that space is having my own spatial temporal relationship to colonialism, actually engaging with the port cities of Holland and Rotterdam and The Hague, actually engaging and actually being situated and living in Deptford, actually interacting on a campus that's already predicated on slavery, slave ships, so on and so forth. What I became interested in is how that double consciousness, or what Masumi described as his double existence, actually emerges in the perceptual space. And to feel the inaction of both my history and present interact within those spatial temporal spaces, and knowing how I could specifically feel colonialism, even if I could not identify its explicitness within a colonial space. So that's where I'm theoretically trying to come into how that space is communicated. So what it led me to is thinking through how actually this space can be perceived, or actually, better yet, how it can be captured. And it was sort of born of a collaboration that Conrad Moriarty-Cole and I did last year for Techno Resistance and Black Futures in the form of an audio mixtape. And we tried to think about different ways to sort of articulate that. Conrad's here, by the way. And Conrad's doing almost finished with a PhD in media and comms. And we spent a lot of time talking through the space, and a principal portion of his work is within the imagination and perception itself, and thinking through how that perception intersects with Blackness. So we started developing this project, which we first showed at Strom and The Hague. It's in no way a complete project. It started off as simply an audio project, with the idea that basically what we're trying to construct is a self-guided walking tour, a colonial self-guided walking tour, where you would actually listen to both the transmission of Blackness in tension with the dissonance of colonialism, and you would actually experience it at key moments of a city's colonial past. We figured out in the process that we probably needed some articulation of some visual coherency, so we sort of were trying to tie these aspects together. So in no way is this a final cut. In no way is it a final project, if you can even call it that. We like to think of it in terms of a meditation itself that is drawing us into trying to answer this fundamental question of being as dissonance. So I think I'm just going to play that, and maybe we'll hit the lights, and we can see what's happening here. One final note that I'll make before I show the video is you'll notice that there are certain interventions on color study, and one of the reasons why we're thinking through that aspect is to try to, as me personally, trying to engage with the current field of Black study, who have adopted this sense of non-representation. And if anyone's familiar with the canon of Black study that's emerging now, is thinking through fundamental questions about the origin of Blackness itself. And a lot of that work is happening through thinking about quantum physics, going back to color study, going back to actually the essence of Blackness, not as negation, but as all-encompassing potential. So I want to I'll just play that now and we'll see what happens. So I'll end it there. It's just speaking in the dark here. So what we envisioned it as is, of course, it's a growing project, and of course the project would be much longer and much more extensive, but we wanted to have something tangible to actually start to work with and start to build with in relationship to that object. So that's it. Thanks. Thank you.
So John Cussans is an artist and writer who draws on the cultural legacies of surrealism, critical ethnography, popular genres of sci-fi, horror and supernatural. He's the co-founder of several collaborative projects, including the Bug House, which is a fantastic iteration that he had, in memory of Philip K. Dick, the Free School in the New Dark Age, and the Diagram Research Use and Generation Group. Since 2009, he's been closely involved with the Ghetto Biennale in Haiti, often working with the Haitian video collective Taylor Ghetto. He's currently working on a cross-cultural artistic research project called the Skullcracker Suite, inspired by Hox Hock, the giant cannibal crane of Quackyatul legend, investigating processes of cultural decolonisation in British Columbia since the 1970s. His book, Undead Uprising, Haiti Horror and the Zombie Complex, came out with Strange Attractor Press recently and explores the use of Haiti as the focus for Euro-American fears about African culture. I should just say that John, I mean, we've had John here a few times, but he's, for me, well, I've said this to him many times, he's a bit of a kind of an exemplar of what kind of scholarly and artistic work might be, partly because he's a maverick thinker and a slight outsider of the academy, and it's always an absolute joy, actually, to welcome him in. So, John.
Okay, but I need to get on the screen, if that's possible. Can somebody help me get on screen? Hello, everyone. Thanks, Maggie, for inviting me. I have to say it's not an enviable task to follow that amazing set of talks that have just happened. So I'll try to be light. In fact, I will be light, and I'll be quite quick, because also I realise we're quite compressed for time. So, and also, thankfully, Stephanie covered quite a lot of the things that I was going to talk about. Thanks, Stephanie. Okay, the title of the talk is Pressing for Human at the Alien Encounter Group, and I will just, I'm going to, I'll talk for a few minutes. I'm going to show a short film, a sketch for future work that I made, and I'll just go ahead. And thank you, everybody, for asking such great questions as well, and for being such a great audience. And it's been amazing, so I just don't want to say any more. I don't want to waste any more time. Okay, so this is part of a project which Stephanie has spoken about called the Skullcracker Suite, and I want to say a little bit about the Skullcracker Suite, where this project came from. This is an image from Edward, well, it's a publicity still for a film called In the Land of the Headhunters by Edward S. Curtis, a famous photographer and documenter of Native American life at the end of the century before last. And it's quite importantly one of the first films made with an entirely indigenous Native American cast, based on the stories, based on the legends of the Quackyatul people. That's how they were called at that time, 1914. Now broadly referred to as the Kwakwakwayak, or the Kwagulth-speaking people of British Columbia. And the project, the Skullcracker Suite, is named after this bird in the middle, which is Hox Hock, a giant cannibal crane who legendarily cracked the skulls of humans to eat their brains. And I won't say too much about this because Stephanie has already talked. Sorry, I keep walking in the camera. Stephanie already spoke about Eduardo Viveiros de Castro's concept of cannibal metaphysics, which is quite important for the project. But to cut a long story short, it's very interesting that how can a crane be a cannibal crane? It's called a cannibal because it eats humans. It's this relationship between the animal, which, roughly speaking, broadly speaking, from the perspective of cannibal metaphysics, which Eduardo Viveiros de Castro takes from Amerindian cosmology, any creature which eats another creature is a cannibal, because it's always a fellow creature that we eat. That's a quote from Bataille Theory of Religion, but we'll see that's kind of important too. Okay, to talk about the origin of the Skullcracker Suite, I'll stay in one place. To talk quickly about the origin of the Skullcracker Suite and a personal story. In about 2000, I was invited to teach at Emily Carr University of Art and Design in Vancouver, where I taught a program called The Sacred Revolution, Ethnographic Surrealism and the Sociology of the Sacred. And it was loosely based on my reading of James Clifford, The Predicament of Culture, who introduced the term ethnographic surrealism to describe people like Roger Kellois, Michel Leiris, Leiris' famous book Phantom Africa, where he was on the Dakar Djibouti mission, but he approached it as a surrealist. So he was as interested in his own unconscious fantasies about Africa as he was in being a secretary for the Dakar Djibouti mission, etc., etc. Read the book. The point is that I understood that there was this critical relationship to colonial ethnography that had derived from the avant-gardes in Europe, in particular Paris in the 1920s and 30s, coming out of surrealism. And I was also very influenced by the College of Sociology, which was an independent educational initiative, if you like, using contemporary terms, developed by Bataille and dissident surrealists in the late 1930s. So these are my influences. The important point to make, though, is that I was using this book by Georges Bataille, The Accursed Chair, which has a chapter on potlatch. So the irony was that I was in British Columbia teaching a program at the university there as a white, English-speaking European about potlatch. Now, I didn't know, and I'll say a little bit about potlatch, but there's a chapter on potlatch in Bataille's Accursed Share, the first volume of his 3-volume work on general economy, in which he tries to overturn classical economics. This was the whole project. And he uses potlatch as an example of a non-individualistic, non-rational economy based on excess and expenditure. Now, again, I can't do justice to the book or to the potlatch either, but it's a gift economy basically that was anti-capitalist overall. Now, I was teaching this course on the Sacred Revolution, speaking about potlatch, and I didn't know that in fact potlatch was still being practiced in British Columbia by Native American or Indigenous people. It had in fact never been eliminated. Potlatch, to cut a very complex story short, is the basic means by which title and wealth is distributed amongst various Aboriginal groups of the Pacific Northwest. And they usually happen in winter, but they always happen when someone gains a title, someone is born, someone is married. And these are elaborate ceremonies where the person who hosts the potlatch gathers, accumulates all the wealth they can and distributes it to the community. And it's also practiced around the same time as the winter ceremonials where lots of traditional dances are performed. It was banned by the colonial authorities from 1885 to 1951, which is why it was ironic that I was teaching a course to Canadians, some of whom were First Nations, about something that I thought no longer existed as a theoretical concept from avant-garde anti-capitalist European intellectuals in the 1930s. One of the students that was on that course, and I won't go into the details of this, I'll do the talk, an extended version of this talk some other time, if I'm ever invited. But just to say, this is a drawing of a potlatch from the 1850s, drawn by somebody, an Indian agent. Now, Indian agents were people who were employed by the colonial governments to negotiate and speak with the indigenous groups. So it was drawn by one of those agents of a potlatch ceremony in the 1850s. So one of the students that was on my course in 2000 was a guy called Steve Calvert, an artist, and it turns out that sometime between me being in Vancouver in 2000 and me returning in around 2012, 2013, Steve had gone up to a place called Alert Bay and met this person who is Bo Dick, who Stephanie mentioned, the great artist who sadly recently died, artist and activist, and he'd been attending Bo's and other people's potlatch ceremonies. And I met up with Steve in 2015. He'd communicated with me a few years earlier saying, John, you have to come. The potlatch is alive. It's still going on. And it was a very transformative experience. This is Bo carrying one of the traditional coppers. If you aren't familiar with Bo's work, please go and check it out. Bo is famous for breaking the coppers. These coppers are what Bo would call the credit card of the potlatch culture. They are often exchanged at potlatch ceremonies, and every time they're exchanged, they increase in value. They have an inordinate amount of value associated with them within the potlatch culture. They are also considered to be beings, sentient beings. They have names. These are entities which accumulate all the power of all the gift-giving that happens at any potlatch ceremony. And what Bo did in 2012 and 2013 was to break 2 coppers in front of the legislature of Victoria and Ottawa, the government buildings, in protest of the Canadian government's continual refusal to acknowledge and meet the commitments of their treaty arrangements. So he did these copper breaking ceremonies, which are hugely symbolic and very important acts, where he took, if you just watch them, they break a copper, which is like killing a member of their family, in effect, in front of the legislature building. Bo also is an amazing master carver, or was, and what was great about this for me in terms of Bataillean sensibility, for those of you who don't know, Bataille is interested in non-productive expenditure and excess and sacrifice. You'll understand why this is important. It's not an economy of accumulation, it's an economy of destruction. That Bo would make these beautiful carvings. Bo was already a very established West Coast artist. He could sell his work for thousands of dollars. But instead, during his potlatch ceremony, he threw all the masks that he'd made especially for that ceremony and burnt them in the ritual fire during his potlatch. So he's still performing this sense of chiefly sacrificial expenditure and artistry. Bo was an amazing shamanic figure, as Stephanie's pointed out. Bo was also, as Stephanie mentioned, a member of a secret society called the Hamatsa. And a lot of the West Coast carvers involved in indigenous resurgence were also members of the Hamatsa. This is a work designed by Andy Everson, an amazing West Coast carver, an artist kind of making homage to the Hamatsa cult. Just a little bit about the Hamatsa, not too much, but it was a very important inspiration. The Hamatsa were called a cannibal society. They were known as a cannibal society, and they may indeed have practiced cannibalism at one stage or another. In fact, it's probably likely that they did perform. It doesn't really concern me that much, but just there's a great book on it if you want to look into the history of that. But importantly, the ritual dances of the Hamatsa, which we were privileged enough to attend the potlatch of Chief Alan Hunt, and this is his brother Jaden, who's been initiated into the Hamatsa secret society. The ritual of the Hamatsa is a transition from a state of insatiable human flesh eating. You become a kind of wild person. In traditional allegedly pre-contact Hamatsa ceremonies, the Hamatsa initiate would run into the crowd and bite chunks out of people's flesh and spit it on the floor because he was so insatiable. Of course, it's been argued that these were actually very clever theatrical techniques, and one of the things that I've been interested in and gave birth to the Skullcracker Suite is this idea that the pre-contact Kwakwakria already had incredibly elaborate theatrical stage props, not least things like people would have their heads chopped off and their head would roll across the ground, and then miraculously they'd be resurrected. A lot of theatrical staging of miraculous resurrections in the Longhouse. So this is a Hamatsa initiation ceremony, and the whole ritual and ceremony involves the bringing back of the wild man. It's usually a man, but now there are women initiated into and I guess it doesn't matter at that level whether it's man or woman. It's a man-eater. Is brought back into the Na Mima. This is to be of the same kind. So brought into the realm of whatever we are, us kind, or their, whatever the kind is. So it's a ritual of kind of being insatiably cannibalistic and flesh-eating to becoming one of kind, one of our kind, one of the human kind, whatever kind we are. This is a Mughams mass by Bo Dick. I'll move on because I know I'm already running out of time. But anyway, it's one of Bo's masks. These are the three cannibal birds which accompany Baksbakwala, the cannibal at the north end of the world, and Hoksok is at the top, Raven at the left, and Crooked Beak of Heaven on the right, and they accompanied Baksbakwala. And Bo's having an exhibition a posthumous exhibition in New York next year called Devoured by Consumerism. And to cut a long story short, one of the themes and thinking that's going through my head through all this is, what is this relationship between insatiable flesh eating and insatiable consumerism? And it's something Bo was very conscious of. And the reason we kind of ended up calling it the Skullcracker Suite was because the winter dance ceremonies take place at Christmas. Christmas is also a gift-giving ceremony, but a Christian one. And we wanted to think about something that could parody Western consumerist Christian, and importantly Christian, because Christianity has a very, violent and significant place in the history of colonisation in British Columbia. And I will skip this because there's not enough time. But just to briefly note, there's so much to say about this question, but this question of mythology and the alt-right and the post-truth and these questions around when you delve into the occult, I think Bataille and the group around Acéphale, to me, really already created that. There's always that problem there. The absence of myth, to quote Michael Richardson's collection of Bataille's works. There was this question in the 1930s about what to do with myth, to create a new myth. What do you do? And I think Plastic Fantastique are working through that. So I won't go much longer into that. This is our plan for the Skullcracker Suite, which Stephanie and I drew up. This is how it is, it's always like this. Anyway, sorry. I'm sorry I give too much to try and compress into such a small space, but that's the way it is. I always dream of this 20-hour lecture that I could give somewhere at some time. I just want to leave two quotes, one from Achille Mbembe on necropolitics and colonisation, and Philip K. Dick. And it's interesting that this last quote legend has it, was chosen by random when Simon knew I was looking at Philip K. Dick's exegesis, opened the book at random and sent me the first quote he came to, and it happened to be this quote. So I won't go too much into it because it's too much to try and tear apart, but we like the idea of the skullcracker Hoxhawk as a violent representation of the conflict of colonial violence and counter-colonial violence. This question of the metaphysics of predation, but also what I found as approaching this, I had to approach it as a white, European, English-speaking male. And to do that, I felt it was, to enter into these questions about colonialism and decolonisation in British Columbia, I felt it was necessary to inhabit an avatar. So I felt that Philip K. Dick, who had been in Vancouver in 1972, was a good person to inhabit. And we used this idea of Martian Time Slip, his 1964 novel, to kind of as a template for what we call BC Time Slip, brackets, The Empire Never Ended. So if you haven't read this, you'll know it's a book about, well, if you have read it, if you haven't, anyway. It's about a doomed Mars colonization project by the UN and other forces. And on the planet are a group of people called the Bleak Men, who are loosely modelled, interestingly, on the Sand Bushmen. We tried to we used this. I was particularly inhabited by Philip K. Dick, to try and think through the question of colonialism from the perspective of Europeans, and to ask this question, what compelled Europeans and white Europeans to expand and impose themselves in these ways and other lands. And it's interesting that, I won't mention it too much now, but one of the themes that threads through some of the talks is, if anyone's seen this TV show called Taboo, about a year ago, which tells the story of a sailor who was involved in a story like maybe modelled on the throwing over the slaves. He's in the narrative, he's the guy who was on the ship, in this case he bolted down the hatches when they sunk the ship, and he's traumatised by it, and it's this kind of total trauma of being part of that white colonial mission and the violence that the people who were doing the violence encountered too, and he's been deeply traumatised by it. And anyway, this is the kind of thinking that I was trying to move through. Not enough time. The other thing about Vancouver is that, people are always shooting films in Vancouver. Lots of Philip K. Dick films, like Minority Report, were shot in Vancouver because it's cheap to shoot films there. So Vancouver looks like a Philip K. Dick film set. And when I was there, it absolutely does. When I was there walking around last time, I came across this outside the now defunct Molson beer factory. And I wondered what it was, and it's Salvation Awaits in the Seattle colony. This is obviously a reference to A New Life Awaits You on the off-world colonies, the catchphrase from Blade Runner, the Philip K. Dick film. And really what I wanted to do was approach British Columbia as a colonist. And in fact, it's still happening. That's why we call it The Empire Never Ended. That's also a reference to Philip K. Dick, but it's still ruled by the British Crown. There are still people migrating, Europeans, to live there and work there. It's still being colonised. The process of colonisation is still going on. So what does it mean to talk about decolonisation in a context where colonisation continues to take place on a day-to-day basis? But this just happened to be there. It's just how it works in Vancouver. The Empire Never Ended is a vision Philip K. had with a series of visions in 1974 after he was blasted by a pink beam that he called Vast Active Living Intelligence System, which I think might have something to do with this omnipresent, imminent, yes, maybe it's Valis. Anyway, he also had a vision that, in fact, the empire never ended. That's where we got the expression from. In his vision, the Roman Empire was holographically still imposed on California in the 1970s, and that it was secretly revealed to him by these Gnostic Christians who carried the fish symbol around on their neck. Cut a long story short. I'm just going to move through this. He came to Vancouver in 1972 to give a talk called The Android and the Human. I could talk a lot about the android and the human, but it touches on a lot of things that have been already talked about the synthetic human, the artificial intelligence. Philip K. Dick was very concerned that humans could be simulated and replicated, as in the replicants, etc., and that he personally was finding it difficult to distinguish between the authentic human being and its simulation. I mean, pathologically, he really didn't know at this point. It's one of the characteristics of Philip K. Dick's world, that it blurred, his fictions blurred completely into his reality, and he really didn't know sometimes whether he was talking to humans or simulants. And the only people who really he believed were authentic were dark-haired girls, usually at around 20, 18, sort of hippies, kind of, and they were the absolute kind of epitome of the human, whereas the reflex machine, the android, was always there to kind of trick you into thinking it was human when really it was trying to put you out of a job. So he had a nervous breakdown. He ended up at, as Stephanie said, a First Nations rehab clinic called Ex-Calais, which was a very important cultural centre in Vancouver at the time. And we did some research about that, myself, Stephanie, and Gregoire Dupont. And I'm going to go slightly over time and show you a film that I've been working on with Stephanie, Gregoire, and Steve. While we were in Vancouver, I took on the persona of Philip K. Dick. This is me at the Museum of Anthropology, where Philip K. Dick would have visited, looking at the collection of Hamatsa regalia. This is a Hamatsa headband. These are spherical videos, actually, that you can move around.